It was a quiet evening at the city park, a place where people of all walks of life came to jog, relax, and unwind. The air carried a crispness of calm, the rustle of leaves blending harmoniously with distant laughter from children playing. He was there, dressed in simple workout clothes, catching his breath after a jog. That's when it happened. "Hey, you!" The voice was sharp, almost snarling. A police officer emerged from his cruiser, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he approached with intimidating purpose. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, his gaze piercing with suspicion. The jogger looked up, puzzled. "Is there a problem?" "Yeah, you're the problem," the officer snapped, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Joggers passed by, some averting their eyes, others slowing down to watch. The man held his ground, confused but calm. "I'm jogging. Just like everyone else." The officer scoffed, taking a step closer. "People like you don't belong here. I've had complaints about a suspicious man in this area. Let me see some ID." The words hit like a slap. "People like me?" The jogger's voice remained steady, though his hands clenched at his sides. "I've done nothing wrong." "Don't get smart with me," the officer barked, now towering over him. "Turn around. Hands behind your back. Now." The humiliation was immediate, stinging like an open wound. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some filmed, others whispered, but no one stepped in. The jogger hesitated, his mind racing, heart pounding. "For what? What did I do?" "You're resisting." The officer's tone was louder now, commanding. He shoved the man hard enough to make him stumble. The jogger caught himself and turned, his voice rising. "This is harassment." "I've done nothing." The officer's patience snapped. His boot connected with the man's side, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. A collective gasp came from the small crowd now forming. "Stay down," the officer growled. But the jogger didn't stay down. Slowly, painfully, he rose, dusting himself off. His eyes locked with the officer's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of fear in the latter's expression. "Do you know who I am?" the jogger asked, his voice calm yet charged with unshakable authority. The officer faltered for a moment, his bravado cracking. "I don't care who you are. You're just some punk who thinks he's above the law." A small smirk formed on the jogger's face. "I am the law," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for the officer and everyone else to see. The officer's face went pale. His mouth opened to speak, but no words came out. The crowd erupted in whispers. "Oh my God, he's FBI," someone said. The jogger stepped closer, his calm demeanor now commanding respect. "You just assaulted a federal agent," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And I'm not going to let this slide." The officer took a step back, panic washing over him. His hands trembled as he stammered, I didn't know. Does that excuse what you just did?" The jogger cut him off, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Does not knowing make it right?" The crowd watched, captivated, as the power dynamic shifted entirely. The jogger stood tall, his presence unshaken despite the humiliation he had just endured. The officer, once so confident, now looked like a man about to lose everything. But this was only the beginning. What would come next would not only hold the officer accountable but also expose a system built to protect men like him. The jogger wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged, mistreated, or abused for the color of their skin. And as the crowd continued to gather, as phones continued to record, one question hung in the air: how far would he go to ensure justice was served? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Hello, friends. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say this: Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in all its forms. To anyone watching who has experienced discrimination or prejudice, know that you are seen, you are valued, and you deserve respect and dignity. Our stories aim to spark conversation, reflection, and understanding. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy thought-provoking content with impactful twists, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our mission. Now, sit back and enjoy today's powerful story. The sun was setting over Langston Park, painting the horizon in soft oranges and purples. It was the kind of place you'd see in postcards: clean walking paths, well-manicured grass, and scattered oak trees offering patches of shade. On any given evening, the park was filled with people from all walks of life, from joggers and families enjoying picnics to couples strolling hand in hand. But for Marcus Wright, this was his sanctuary, a quiet space to clear his mind after long, grueling days. Marcus was a man in his mid-30s, tall and athletic, with a quiet confidence about him. His dark skin bore the glow of someone who spent time in the sun, but his sharp brown eyes and furrowed brow hinted at the weight of responsibility he carried. A former Marine turned FBI agent, Marcus was no stranger to challenges. Yet, even with his impressive credentials, he never wore his titles on his sleeve. To the world, he was just a man who jogged at the park every evening, blending in with the crowd. But beneath the surface, Marcus's life was anything but ordinary. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, he grew up in a neighborhood where ambition was a survival skill. His mother, Dolores, worked double shifts as a nurse, while his father, Franklin, ran a small auto repair shop. They had instilled in Marcus the values of hard work, integrity, and resilience. Franklin often said, "Son, the world may judge you before it knows you. But your actions will always speak louder than their assumptions." That lesson had guided Marcus through every stage of his life. It pushed him to excel in school, enlist in the Marines, and eventually climb the ranks within the FBI. Yet, even with his achievements, Marcus had experienced his share of prejudice. He learned to navigate a world where people often saw his skin color before his character. But in moments of peace, like his evening jogs through Langston Park, he allowed himself to let go of those burdens, if only for a little while. On this particular evening, Marcus wore a simple black hoodie, gray joggers, and running shoes. His headphones played a soft jazz playlist as he made his way around the park's 3-mile loop. He liked to time his runs to coincide with the sunset, it gave him a sense of calm. Langston Park was Marcus's refuge, a place where he wasn't an agent, a Marine, or anyone else. He was just Marcus. Across the park, another man was watching. Officer Brent Harper, a patrol cop with the Langston Police Department, sat in his cruiser sipping from a styrofoam coffee cup. Brent was in his early 40s, stocky, with pale skin that reddened easily under stress. His crew-cut and mirrored sunglasses gave him the air of authority he craved, though his face carried lines of frustration and bitterness. Brent's career had never reached the heights he once dreamed of. Assigned to a quiet beat like Langston Park, he often felt invisible, a man doing a job that no one appreciated. But Brent didn't just feel invisible, he felt disrespected. Every day, he passed people who ignored him or treated him like an annoyance. His insecurities had turned into resentment over the years, and that resentment needed an outlet. Tonight, that outlet was Marcus. As Marcus jogged past the cruiser, Brent's eyes narrowed. Something about Marcus's calm demeanor irritated him. To Brent, Marcus didn't fit the image of someone who belonged in Langston Park. "What's he up to?" Brent muttered to himself, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. His suspicion wasn't based on anything rational, just a gut feeling, one that had more to do with his own biases than reality. Brent's partner for the evening, Officer Sarah Green, glanced over from the passenger seat. Sarah was younger, a rookie cop still learning the ropes. She had a softer approach to policing, often questioning Brent's methods. "He's just jogging," Sarah said, her voice hesitant. Brent scoffed. "Yeah, and I bet he's casing the place. Look at him. Doesn't even look like he lives around here." Sarah frowned but said nothing. She'd learned early on not to challenge Brent directly. Still, unease crept into her stomach as Brent unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the cruiser. Meanwhile, Marcus had stopped near a bench to stretch and catch his breath. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park. He didn't notice Brent approaching until he heard the crunch of boots on gravel. "Hey, you!" Brent's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the evening. Marcus turned, removing one earbud. "Yes." Brent's posture was aggressive, his hand resting on his belt near his holstered gun. "What are you doing here?" Marcus blinked, confused. "I'm jogging." "Why?" "You look out of place," Brent said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Got some ID on you?" Marcus straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Out of place. I'm jogging in a public park. Is there a problem?" Brent took a step closer, his voice growing louder. "I said, do you have ID?" The tension in the air was palpable. A few bystanders slowed their steps, sensing that something wasn't right. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't need to show you ID for jogging in a park." Brent's eyes narrowed, and his frustration boiled over. "Don't get smart with me. Hands behind your back, now." "What for?" Marcus asked, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. "What crime am I being accused of?" "You're resisting," Brent snapped, closing the distance between them. Without warning, he shoved Marcus backward, causing him to stumble. A collective gasp came from nearby joggers who had stopped to watch. Marcus steadied himself, anger flashing across his face. "This is harassment," he said firmly. "You're way out of line." But Brent wasn't listening. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of prejudice and insecurity, he lashed out, kicking Marcus in the side. Marcus hit the ground hard, his hands scraping against the gravel path. The humiliation was immediate, stinging more than the physical pain. "Stay down." Brent barked, his voice filled with authority he didn't deserve. For a moment, Marcus lay there, his mind racing. The sting of humiliation was matched only by the fire of indignation building inside him. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd, feel their eyes on him. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up, brushing the dirt off his hoodie. His eyes locked with Brent's, steady and unyielding. "I think you just made the biggest mistake of your career," Marcus said, his voice calm but laced with steel. Brent faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But before he could respond, Marcus straightened to his full height, his presence commanding. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable, and the onlookers sensed it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The night air hung heavy with tension, the murmurs of the small crowd at Langston Park mixing with the distant hum of city life. Marcus stood tall, his sharp eyes locked on Brent, whose once cocky demeanor was starting to crumble under the weight of his own actions. For a moment, the world seemed frozen in place, the officer and the jogger locked in a silent battle of wills. Brent finally broke the silence, his voice defensive and sharp. "You're causing a scene," he said, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced around at the gathering onlookers. His partner, Sarah, had stepped out of the cruiser and now stood several feet away, her arms crossed tightly, uncertainty written across her face. "I'm causing a scene," Marcus repeated, his voice calm but cutting. He gestured toward the people recording with their phones. "No, officer, you're causing a scene. A scene that's going to follow you for a very long time." Brent flushed, the redness creeping up his neck. He stepped forward, his hand still hovering near his belt. "I don't take threats lightly." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Neither do I." The bystanders began to murmur louder. A man in a business suit called out, "Hey, leave him alone. He didn't do anything." A woman holding a child close added, "You can't treat people like this." The crowd was no longer just curious, they were angry. Brent could feel their eyes boring into him, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a suffocating blanket. He glanced over at Sarah, who met his gaze with a look that seemed to say, "This isn't right." "Officer Harper," Sarah said hesitantly, her voice breaking through the tense air. "Maybe we should stay out of this," Brent snapped, cutting her off before she could finish. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying the dynamics between the two officers. It was clear that Sarah was uncomfortable, but whether she'd act on that discomfort remained to be seen. Marcus knew he needed to tread carefully. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation further, but he also couldn't let this stand. "Let me make something clear," Marcus said, his voice steady and deliberate. "I've done nothing wrong. I've complied with every law. And yet, here I am, shoved, kicked, and humiliated for no reason other than your assumptions about me." Brent opened his mouth to retort, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "And here's what's worse," Marcus continued, his tone growing sharper. "You don't even realize what you've done. Or maybe you do, and you just don't care. Either way, it's unacceptable." The crowd began to murmur again, their discontent growing louder. Brent's jaw tightened as he scanned the faces around him, looking for an ally and finding none. His world was closing in, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. "I said you're resisting," Brent muttered, almost to himself, as if clinging to a flimsy justification for his actions. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Resisting what? Jogging? Stretching? Breathing?" The sarcasm in Marcus's voice hit Brent like a slap, and for a moment, the officer seemed genuinely at a loss. Sarah took a small step forward, her voice softer but firm. "Officer Harper, maybe we should step back and reassess. This isn't enough." Brent barked, cutting her off again. But his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. His confidence was unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of Marcus's steady gaze and the judgment of the growing crowd. One of the bystanders, a young man with a camera phone, stepped closer. "What's your badge number, officer?" he called out. "People are gonna want to know." Brent spun around, his face twisting in frustration. "Back off," he snapped. But the damage was done. The moment was captured on video, his anger and defensiveness immortalized for the world to see. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Brent and Marcus. She looked like she wanted to intervene but was held back by the unwritten rules of loyalty and hierarchy. Marcus saw her hesitation and decided to address her directly. "Officer Green," he said, his tone softening just enough to catch her attention. "You know this isn't right. You can see it as clearly as everyone else here. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Sarah's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing slightly. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, glancing at Brent, who was now glaring at her. The tension between the two officers was palpable, a crack forming in the fragile veneer of their partnership. Before she could speak, another voice broke through the crowd, a man wearing a park maintenance uniform. "I saw the whole thing," he said, stepping forward. "This guy didn't do anything. You're out of line, officer." Brent's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frustration boiling over. "This is a police matter," he said through gritted teeth. "I suggest you stay out of it." But the man didn't back down. "And I suggest you learn to treat people with respect," he shot back. The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective anger building. Marcus could feel the shift in the air, the tide turning against Brent. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The humiliation Brent had inflicted on him was only the tip of the iceberg. The real battle was just beginning, and Marcus was determined to see it through. He took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute. "This ends here," he said, his eyes locking with Brent's. "But it doesn't end now." Brent frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces watching him. "Thank you for standing up," he said, addressing them directly. "Your voices matter. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." The crowd responded with nods and murmurs of agreement, their energy shifting from passive observation to active solidarity. Brent took a step back, his confidence visibly shaken. Even Sarah seemed to take heart from Marcus's words, her posture straightening as she stood a little taller. As Marcus turned and began to walk away, the crowd parted to let him pass. But the murmurs didn't die down. If anything, they grew louder, the weight of the moment sinking into everyone who had witnessed it. Brent stood frozen, his hands still clenched at his sides. He felt the stares, the judgment, the condemnation. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt about his actions, his authority, and the man he had become. Marcus didn't look back. He had a plan, and this was only the beginning. The events of that night would set off a chain reaction, one that would shake the foundations of not just Brent's life, but the entire system that allowed men like him to thrive. And as the crowd began to disperse, one question lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy with anticipation: what would Marcus do next? The small, dimly lit conference room buzzed with the tension of unspoken words. Marcus sat at one end of the long oak table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Officer Brent Harper fidgeted in his seat, his jaw tight, his forehead glistening with sweat under the fluorescent lights. To Brent's left, his partner, Officer Sarah Green, looked down at the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Seated next to Marcus was Agent Karen Douglas, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman with years of experience in internal affairs. She had been called in to mediate the meeting after Marcus's formal complaint had landed on her desk. Behind her, a projection screen displayed the date and time-stamped footage from Langston Park, the footage that had gone viral, showing Brent kicking Marcus and shouting commands while Marcus tried to regain his footing. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. The silence dragged on, suffocating in its weight, until Karen leaned forward and broke it. "Officer Harper," she began, her voice measured and firm, "do you have anything to say about what we just watched?" Brent's face flushed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Look, this whole thing has been blown out of proportion," he said, his voice tight. "That video doesn't show the whole story." Karen arched an eyebrow, her pen poised over a notepad. "Then why don't you tell us the whole story?" Brent shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Sarah as if hoping for support. But Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the table, her expression conflicted. Brent cleared his throat. "That guy," he stopped himself and gestured vaguely toward Marcus, who didn't flinch. "He was acting suspicious. I had to investigate." "Suspicious how?" Karen asked, her tone sharp. Brent hesitated. "He was, loitering. Looked like he might be up to something. People don't just hang around that park at night." Marcus's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I was jogging." The simplicity of his statement made Brent's excuse sound hollow. Karen nodded, encouraging Marcus to continue. "I was jogging," Marcus repeated, his voice calm but deliberate. "As I do every evening in Langston Park. That's not loitering. That's not suspicious. That's existing." Brent opened his mouth to argue, but Karen held up a hand to stop him. "Officer Harper, I want to remind you that you are under investigation for misconduct. I suggest you choose your words carefully." Brent clenched his jaw, his face reddening further. "Fine. Maybe I was wrong. But I didn't know who he was." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Brent's. "And if I hadn't been who I am, would it have mattered? Would you have treated me any differently?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Brent shifted in his seat, his bravado slipping further away. Karen tapped her pen against her notepad, her eyes narrowing. "Officer Green," Karen said, turning her attention to Sarah, who visibly tensed. You were present during the incident. Do you have anything to add? Sarah hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her notepad. She glanced at Marcus, then at Brent, her internal conflict playing out in her expression. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. I wasn't comfortable with how things happened, she admitted, her voice soft but steady. It didn't feel right. Brent turned to her, his eyes wide with betrayal. Sarah, what the hell are you doing? Sarah flinched but held her ground. I'm telling the truth, Brent. You were aggressive from the start. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and you escalated it. I should have spoken up sooner. Brent stared at her, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. Karen, meanwhile, nodded approvingly, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. Thank you, Officer Green, Karen said. She turned back to Brent. It seems there's a pattern here. You made an assumption, acted on that assumption, and when confronted with the truth, you doubled down instead of admitting your mistake. Brent's hands clenched into fists on the table. I was doing my job. Karen's expression hardened. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and assault innocent people. The words hit Brent like a slap, and for a moment, the room was silent again. Then Marcus spoke, his voice calm but filled with quiet intensity. This isn't just about what happened to me, he said, his eyes fixed on Brent. This is about every person who's been stopped, questioned, or hurt because someone in a position of power made a snap judgment about who they are. This isn't just your mistake, Officer Harper. It's a systemic failure. Karen nodded, her expression grim. And that's exactly why we're here. This investigation isn't just about disciplinary action, it's about accountability. Brent's face was pale now, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had said what he needed to say, and now the rest was out of his hands. Karen stood, signaling the end of the meeting. We'll be reviewing all the evidence and making a decision soon. Officer Harper, I suggest you prepare yourself for the consequences of your actions. As the room emptied, Brent lingered, his mind racing. Sarah avoided his gaze as she left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Marcus was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Brent. You had a choice, Marcus said quietly. And you chose wrong. With that, he walked out, leaving Brent alone in the empty conference room, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like never before. Outside the building, Marcus stepped into the cool night air, his breath visible in the chill. He had faced men like Brent before, and he knew this wasn't the end of the fight. But tonight, he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The system wasn't perfect, but it was starting to crack, and that was enough for now. For Marcus, the battle for justice was never about revenge, it was about creating a world where no one else would have to endure what he had. And as he walked away, the question lingered, was this just the beginning of a larger reckoning? Brent sat in his cruiser that night, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The parking lot outside the precinct was nearly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. He had stayed behind after the meeting, unable to face the questions and whispers that would undoubtedly follow him home. His mind replayed Marcus's words over and over again, you had a choice, and you chose wrong. For years, Brent had justified his actions as necessary for keeping order, but now those justifications felt like thin excuses, unraveling under the weight of the consequences he was beginning to understand. The video of Langston Park had gone viral, and it was only a matter of time before it made national headlines. He wasn't just facing an internal investigation, he was facing the court of public opinion. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at the screen, Karen Douglas, Internal Affairs. His stomach tightened as he picked it up. Harper, he said, his voice hollow. Karen's voice came through, sharp and clipped. Officer Harper, I need you to come back to the precinct. Now. Brent frowned, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. It's past midnight. What's this about? Just get here, Karen said curtly before hanging up. Brent cursed under his breath, starting the engine. The drive back to the precinct was short, but each red light and stop sign felt like an eternity. When he arrived, the parking lot was slightly busier than before. A few unmarked vehicles sat near the entrance, their occupants silhouetted by the glow of laptops inside. As Brent stepped into the building, he was met by Karen in the hallway. Her expression was stern, but there was a glint of something unreadable in her eyes. Was it anger? Disappointment? Pity? He couldn't tell. "Follow me," she said without preamble, leading him down the corridor. They entered a different conference room this time, smaller and more sterile, with no windows. Inside, Marcus sat across the table, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. Next to him was a man Brent didn't recognize, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, wearing a tailored suit that screamed authority. The man stood as Brent entered, extending a hand. "Officer Harper," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Deputy Director James Ellison." Brent froze, his mind racing. Deputy Director. FBI. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. He shook Ellison's hand reluctantly, his own palm clammy. "Have a seat," Karen instructed, motioning to a chair opposite Marcus. Brent obeyed, his movements stiff and mechanical. As soon as he sat, Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His expression wasn't angry or smug, it was calm, controlled, and unwavering. It was the kind of look that made Brent feel as if Marcus could see straight through him. Ellison spoke first. "Officer Harper, I've been brought in because this situation has escalated beyond the jurisdiction of Langston PD. What happened at Langston Park isn't just a matter of misconduct, it's a matter of federal concern." Brent's stomach churned. "Federal concern," he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Ellison said firmly. "Agent Wright," he gestured to Marcus, was assaulted by a police officer in what appears to be a clear case of racial profiling. This is a serious matter, one that has implications far beyond your department." Brent glanced at Marcus, who remained silent, his gaze steady. "I didn't know he was FBI," Brent said defensively, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "You didn't know who I was, but you assumed you knew what I was. That assumption led you to abuse your authority, to humiliate me in public, and to escalate a situation that never should have happened." Brent's face burned with shame and anger. "I was doing my job," he muttered. "No," Marcus said sharply. "You weren't. Your job is to protect and serve, not to profile and intimidate." Ellison leaned forward, his expression serious. "Officer Harper, this investigation isn't just about you. It's about uncovering the systemic issues that allow incidents like this to happen. You're a part of something much larger, a culture of policing that needs to change." Brent's hands clenched into fists on his lap. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. Karen spoke up for the first time. "Now, we determine the consequences of your actions. This investigation will proceed, and based on the evidence, there will be recommendations for disciplinary action." Brent looked at her, his face a mixture of defiance and desperation. "You're going to ruin my career over one mistake." "One mistake?" Marcus said, his voice rising for the first time. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This wasn't a mistake, Harper. A mistake is forgetting your coffee on the counter. What you did was a choice, a deliberate decision to treat me as less than human." The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Brent's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules and kept people safe. But now, he couldn't escape the reality of what he had done. Ellison broke the silence. "Officer Harper, I suggest you take this opportunity to reflect on your actions and what led you here. This isn't just about your career, it's about accountability, justice, and the kind of person you want to be moving forward." Brent didn't respond. He stared down at the table, his mind a chaotic swirl of anger, guilt, and confusion. Karen stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll be in touch," she said, her tone curt. "For now, you're on administrative leave." As Brent left the room, his shoulders hunched and his steps heavy, Marcus watched him go, a flicker of something, was it pity, crossing his face. He knew Brent's story wasn't unique, and that was what made it all the more tragic. Marcus turned to Ellison. "What's next?" he asked. Ellison smiled faintly. "Next, we keep fighting. One step at a time." And as Marcus walked out of the precinct into the crisp night air, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. For justice. For change. For a world where no one else would have to endure what he had. The question remained, how far would the ripples of this moment reach? The following morning, the precinct was buzzing. Word of the internal affairs meeting had spread like wildfire among the officers, and speculation filled the hallways. Some whispered that Brent Harper was done for, while others wondered how deep the fallout would go. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same after Langston Park. In an unassuming office on the second floor, Marcus sat across from Karen and Ellison once again. The room was quieter this time, more intimate. A large manila folder sat on the table between them, thick with papers and reports. Karen pushed it toward Marcus. "These are the preliminary findings of our investigation," she said. "We've reviewed the footage, the statements from witnesses, and Officer Green's testimony. Everything points to a pattern of behavior within Langston PD, one that goes beyond Harper." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I had a feeling." Ellison leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on Marcus. "This isn't just about Brent Harper anymore, Agent Wright. This is an opportunity. With the evidence we've gathered, we can push for systemic reforms, not just in this department, but as a precedent for others across the country." Marcus's gaze dropped to the folder. His hands rested on the edge, but he didn't open it. "And Harper?" he asked quietly. "Harper will face disciplinary action, possibly termination," Karen said. "But that's just the surface. If we stop there, nothing changes. We need to dig deeper." Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had started this fight out of personal necessity, but now it had grown into something larger, something that could make a real difference. "Let's do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes." Karen and Ellison exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. Karen stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll need your continued cooperation, Agent Wright. This isn't going to be easy." "It never is," Marcus replied, standing as well. As they exited the room, Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. That same afternoon, Brent sat alone in his living room, the blinds drawn tight against the midday sun. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the coffee table, calls from colleagues, texts from friends, and notifications from social media. He ignored them all, staring blankly at the news playing on the TV. The footage of Langston Park was everywhere now, replayed on every channel with headlines like "FBI agent harassed by local officer" and "Racial profiling scandal rocks Langston PD." Brent's face was plastered across the screen, frozen in a grimace of anger as he shouted at Marcus. His wife, Linda, entered the room, her arms crossed. She had barely spoken to him since the news broke, and the tension between them was palpable. "Brent," she said, her voice tight, "how could you let this happen?" He didn't look at her. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered for what felt like the 100th time. "That doesn't matter," she snapped, her frustration spilling over. "You shouldn't have treated anyone like that, FBI agent or not. Brent finally turned to face her, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. You think I'm the only one who does this? I was doing my job. Everyone's acting like I'm some kind of monster, but I was just following protocol. Linda's eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Maybe it's time to ask yourself why that protocol feels so natural to you. Why it felt okay to kick a man who wasn't even resisting. Brent opened his mouth to respond but found he had no words. Linda sighed and shook her head. You need to figure this out, Brent. Because if you don't, I don't know what's left for us. She left the room, leaving Brent alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, was I wrong? Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Sarah Green sat in the break room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She had been avoiding Brent all day, unable to face the fallout of her testimony. She knew she had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. Marcus entered the room, his presence commanding as always. He spotted Sarah and approached her, his expression unreadable. Officer Green, he said, his voice steady. Mind if I sit? She shook her head, and he took the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Marcus broke the silence. You did the right thing, he said simply. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. Did I? It doesn't feel that way. Marcus nodded, understanding. Doing the right thing rarely feels easy. But it matters. Your testimony didn't just help this investigation, it's a step toward change. Sarah hesitated, then asked, do you think it'll make a difference? Or is this just going to blow over like everything else? Marcus's expression hardened, his resolve clear. It'll make a difference because we won't let it blow over. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, people willing to stand up and say, this isn't right. Sarah nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. As Marcus stood to leave, he turned back to her. If you ever doubt yourself, just remember this, silence allows injustice to thrive. Speaking up is how we fight it. Sarah watched him go, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions, fear, determination, and a newfound sense of purpose. As the sun set over the city, Marcus stood on the steps of the precinct, staring out at the horizon. The battle ahead was daunting, but he was ready. For himself, for those who had suffered in silence, and for a system that desperately needed to change. Because the fight for justice was far from over, and Marcus Wright wasn't backing down. The following days unfolded like the slow roll of a storm, inevitable and heavy with consequence. Marcus found himself at the epicenter of a media whirlwind, his name and face appearing on television screens and social media feeds nationwide. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but the public's hunger for justice turned him into an unwitting symbol of systemic reform. Meanwhile, at Langston PD, the fallout from the investigation was growing more severe by the hour. Brent Harper's actions were no longer just an individual embarrassment, they had become the starting point for an avalanche of revelations. Internal Affairs, alongside the FBI, had uncovered multiple complaints against Brent and other officers in the department. Patterns of racial profiling, misuse of force, and buried misconduct reports painted a grim picture of a system designed to protect its own at the expense of accountability. Karen Douglas and her team had spent late nights combing through case files and interviewing witnesses. Each new piece of evidence seemed to open another door, leading to further cracks in the department's foundation. For Marcus, the battle was no longer just about holding Brent accountable, it was about dismantling the culture that allowed officers like him to thrive. One afternoon, Marcus sat in a conference room at FBI headquarters with Karen and Deputy Director Ellison. A whiteboard behind them was covered in notes, diagrams, and timelines connecting names and incidents from Langston PD. We've confirmed at least 7 other cases where Officer Harper used excessive force, Karen said, flipping through a stack of reports. 3 of those incidents involved black men who were either charged with minor infractions or released without charges after the fact. Ellison nodded, his expression grim. And the department's leadership? Karen glanced at Marcus before answering. Complicit, or at the very least, negligent. Complaints were filed, but they were buried or dismissed. It's systemic, sir. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. And the community? Have we reached out to the people affected? Karen hesitated. Not yet. That's delicate. Some of these individuals might not want to revisit what happened to them. Marcus shook his head. We need their voices. This isn't just about exposing the system, it's about giving people a platform to share their experiences. Without that, it's just another investigation. Ellison placed a hand on the table, commanding their attention. Agent Wright's right. This fight isn't just about paperwork or statistics, it's about people. Let's coordinate with community leaders, activists, and anyone else who can help amplify these stories. This can't just be about Harper, it has to be about the system as a whole. Karen nodded, scribbling notes in her planner. Marcus exhaled, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He had become a reluctant leader in this fight, and the path forward was daunting. But he knew what was at stake, not just for himself, but for countless others who had been silenced by the same system. Across town, Brent Harper sat in his modest home, staring blankly at the television. The news cycle was relentless, dissecting every aspect of his actions and their aftermath. The viral footage from Langston Park played on repeat, each replay chiseling away at the man he thought he was. Linda entered the room, her expression tired but resolute. She placed a cup of coffee on the table in front of him before sitting on the opposite end of the couch. You need to do something, she said quietly. Brent didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the screen. Linda sighed, leaning forward. Brent, this isn't going away. You're not going to get your life back by sitting here and wallowing. He finally turned to her, his face etched with frustration. What do you want me to do, Linda? Apologize on live TV? Beg for forgiveness? Nothing I say is going to change how people see me now. Linda's gaze hardened. This isn't about how people see you, it's about what kind of man you want to be. You made a mistake, Brent. A big one. But that doesn't mean you can't try to make it right. Brent leaned back, his shoulders slumping. And how do I do that? Linda hesitated before answering. You start by owning up to what you did. Not just to Marcus Wright, but to yourself. Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Brent rubbed his face with his hands, exhaustion and guilt written in every movement. He had spent so much of his life justifying his actions, convincing himself that he was the good guy. Now, that illusion was shattered, and he was left to face the truth. The next day, Marcus found himself standing in front of a crowded room at a local community center. He had agreed to speak at a town hall organized by activists and community leaders, many of whom had experienced or witnessed the kind of treatment he had endured. The room buzzed with energy, anger, hope, and a determination to see change. Karen stood near the back of the room, her arms crossed as she observed. Marcus stepped up to the podium, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd. Thank you for being here, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened to me at Langston Park wasn't unique. It was one moment in a long history of injustice that has affected countless people in this city and beyond. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding as Marcus continued. I'm not here to tell you something you don't already know. You've lived it. You've felt it. But I am here to tell you that things are starting to change. The investigation into Langston PD is just the beginning, and we need your voices to make sure it doesn't stop here. A hand shot up in the crowd, a middle-aged man with a weary face and piercing eyes. How do we know this won't just be another investigation that goes nowhere? He asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Marcus met his gaze, his expression resolute. Because we won't let it. Because we're not just fighting for justice, we're fighting for accountability. For transparency. For a system that serves everyone, not just a select few. Applause rippled through the room, the energy shifting toward hope. Karen watched from the back, a faint smile on her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were making real progress. But even as Marcus inspired the crowd, he knew the fight was far from over. The path ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. And somewhere, he knew, Brent Harper was grappling with his own choices, a man at a crossroads, facing the most difficult decision of his life. The story was building to a crescendo, each thread pulling tighter as the stakes grew higher. What Brent would do next, and how Marcus would continue to lead this fight, remained unanswered questions. But one thing was certain, the reckoning had only just begun. That night, Marcus returned to his apartment, the day's events weighing heavily on him. The community meeting had been a success, but the stories shared by the attendees haunted him, each one a reminder of how pervasive and entrenched the problem was. He sat on the edge of his couch, his hands clasped, staring at the city lights through his window. His phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. When he glanced at the screen, his eyebrows furrowed. The caller ID read Brent Harper. For a moment, Marcus considered ignoring the call. But something compelled him to answer. Taking a steadying breath, he picked up. "Harper," he said, his voice guarded. There was a pause on the other end, then Brent's voice came through, low and hesitant. "Agent Wright. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." "I'm surprised you called," Marcus replied evenly. "What do you want?" Brent exhaled audibly. I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," Marcus said, his tone firm but not unkind. Another pause. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About what I did. And it's eating me alive, man. I can't sleep. I can't look at myself in the mirror." Marcus didn't respond immediately, letting Brent's words hang in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with steel. "You should feel that way. You humiliated me, disrespected me, and used your power to try to put me in my place. And for what? Because you thought you could." "I know," Brent said quickly, his voice cracking. "I know I was wrong. I've been wrong for a long time. But I didn't see it, no, I didn't want to see it." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "So, what now? Do you want me to absolve you? Tell you it's all okay?" "No," Brent said, almost desperately. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need to do something. I can't live with this guilt." Marcus sighed, his frustration mingling with a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, pity. "Understanding. You want to make it right? Then take responsibility. Speak out. Tell the truth, not just about what you did, but about the system that enabled you to do it." Brent's silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, he whispered, "That's not easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Marcus replied. "But if you're serious about change, it's the only way." The next day, Marcus was back at FBI headquarters when Karen called him into her office. He found her standing by the window, a cup of coffee in hand, her expression thoughtful. "Got a call from Harper this morning," she said without preamble. "He wants to meet." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Did he say why?" Karen shrugged. "Just said he had something to say." He sounded different. Marcus folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Do you trust him?" Karen turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I trust that he's scared. And scared people can be unpredictable. But I also think he might be genuine." Marcus considered this, his mind replaying their phone conversation. "Set it up," he said finally. "I'll hear him out." The meeting was arranged for later that afternoon in a neutral location, a small conference room in a city government building. Marcus arrived first, accompanied by Karen and Ellison. They took their seats, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Brent walked in. He looked different, his normally defiant posture was replaced with slumped shoulders, and his eyes held a mixture of exhaustion and regret. He hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Agent Wright," he said, nodding stiffly. "Deputy Director. Ms. Douglas." Karen gestured to the seat across from Marcus. "Take a seat, Officer Harper." Brent sat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him on the table. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Brent cleared his throat. "I want to start by saying. I'm sorry," he began, his voice shaky. "Not just to you, Agent Wright, but to everyone I've hurt. I've spent years telling myself that I was just doing my job, that I wasn't the problem. But that's a lie. I am the problem." Marcus studied him, his expression unreadable. "Why now, Harper? Why not admit this years ago, when it mattered to the people you wronged?" Brent flinched but nodded. "Because I was a coward. I was too afraid to look at myself and see the truth. But now, after everything that's happened, I can't hide from it anymore." Karen leaned forward. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Brent hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I'll testify. About Langston Park, about the other incidents I was involved in, and about what I've seen in the department. It's not just me. There are others, officers, supervisors, even leadership. They've all played a part in this." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You're willing to turn on your own?" Brent met his gaze, his expression resolute. "They stopped being my own when I realized what we were doing was wrong. I'm ready to face whatever comes my way, but I won't go down protecting a system that doesn't deserve to exist." The room fell silent, Brent's words hanging heavy in the air. Marcus exchanged a glance with Karen and Ellison, their expressions reflecting the same mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. Ellison broke the silence. "If you're serious about this, Officer Harper, you'll need to provide concrete evidence. Names, dates, documents, anything that can corroborate your testimony." "I understand," Brent said, his voice steady. "I'll give you everything I have." Marcus nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "This doesn't erase what you did, Harper. But it's a start." Brent nodded, his eyes filled with a determination Marcus hadn't seen before. "I know. And I'm ready to do what it takes." As the meeting ended, Marcus stepped outside into the crisp evening air, his mind buzzing with the weight of what had just transpired. Brent's decision to come forward was unexpected, and the implications were enormous. For the first time, it felt like the tide was truly turning. But as Marcus looked out at the city skyline, he knew the fight wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and resistance. Yet, for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The question now was whether Brent's testimony would be enough to break the system wide open, or if the forces that upheld it would find a way to survive. Either way, Marcus was ready for the next battle. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, the sound of the gavel echoing like a thunderclap. The tension in the air was palpable, every seat filled with members of the public, media, and those directly affected by the revelations surrounding Langston PD. At the defense table sat Brent Harper, his face pale but determined, flanked by his lawyer. Across the aisle, Marcus Wright sat with Deputy Director Ellison and Karen Douglas, their expressions stoic but resolute. The trial had become the focal point of national attention. Brent's decision to testify against his department had turned the case into a landmark moment in the fight for police accountability. Over weeks of testimony, Brent had named names, detailed practices, and exposed cover-ups that implicated not only officers but also high-ranking officials in Langston PD. His evidence had sparked outrage, protests, and a renewed demand for systemic change. As the final day of proceedings began, Brent was called to the stand one last time. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie as he made his way to the witness chair. The room held its collective breath as he took the oath. "Officer Harper," the prosecutor began, pacing in front of him, "you've admitted to your own misconduct and provided extensive evidence of systemic corruption within Langston PD. Why did you decide to come forward?" Brent glanced at Marcus, his gaze lingering before he turned back to the prosecutor. His voice was steady, though filled with emotion. "Because it was the right thing to do. For years, I convinced myself that I was just following orders, doing my job. But the truth is, I was part of the problem. When I realized the harm I'd caused, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to take responsibility." The prosecutor nodded. "And what do you hope to achieve by coming forward?" Brent took a deep breath. "I hope that by exposing the truth, we can begin to rebuild trust. To create a system that holds people like me accountable and ensures that no one else has to endure what Agent Wright did." The room was silent, Brent's words hanging heavy in the air. Marcus watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. Weeks later, the verdict came in. The court found multiple officers and officials within Langston PD guilty of misconduct, including the chief of police, who had been complicit in covering up numerous complaints. Brent was sentenced to a reduced term due to his cooperation, but his career in law enforcement was over. For Marcus, the verdict was a victory, but it wasn't the end of his work. The fallout from the case had sparked widespread conversations about police reform, and Marcus found himself at the forefront of those efforts. He was invited to speak at universities, community centers, and even congressional hearings, using his experience to advocate for meaningful change. One evening, months after the trial, Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium at a major university. The room was filled with students, activists, and leaders eager to hear his perspective. He spoke with passion, recounting not just his own story but the broader implications of what had happened. "This isn't about one officer or one department," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "This is about a culture that prioritizes power over accountability, prejudice over justice. Changing that culture isn't easy, but it starts with each of us demanding better, from our leaders, from our institutions, and from ourselves." The crowd erupted in applause as Marcus stepped back from the podium. He felt a sense of purpose, knowing that his story had become a catalyst for change. As for Brent Harper, his path was less clear. After serving his sentence, he moved to a small town, far from the spotlight. He took a job as a mechanic, a far cry from his days in uniform. But he didn't shy away from his past. Brent began speaking at local events, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. He openly admitted his mistakes, urging others to reflect on their own biases and the systems they upheld. One evening, after a community event, Brent was approached by a young man who had been in the audience. "You made a lot of mistakes," the man said, his tone cautious. "I did," Brent replied, meeting his gaze. The young man hesitated before continuing. "But I think it takes guts to admit that. Maybe we all need to look in the mirror sometimes." Brent nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. It wasn't redemption, he knew that. But it was a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. The ripple effects of the Langston Park case continued for years. The department underwent sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, the establishment of an independent oversight board, and increased transparency in handling complaints. Other cities began to take notice, implementing similar measures in their own police departments. For Marcus, the journey wasn't without its challenges, but the victories outweighed the setbacks. He remained a dedicated advocate, balancing his work with moments of peace, often jogging through the same park where everything had started. The sunsets at Langston Park reminded him of how far he had come, and how far there was still to go. This story isn't just about Marcus, Brent, or Langston PD. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make, the systems we uphold, and the courage it takes to demand better. Brent Harper's journey shows that accountability and growth are possible, even for those who've made grave mistakes. Marcus writes, resilience reminds us that standing up for justice can create ripples that lead to real change. What do you think about Brent's decision to come forward? Do you believe people can truly change, even after making unforgivable mistakes? And what about Marcus? What would you have done in his position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in these conversations. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more thought-provoking narratives, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit the like button. Together, we can continue exploring the stories that challenge us, inspire us, and, most importantly, make us think. Thank you for watching.